Once upon a time, in a quiet village nestled between rolling green hills and shadowed forests, there lived an old woman who had always longed for a child. Her little cottage, worn by the years, stood alone at the edge of town, where the wind whispered secrets through the trees and the night carried dreams just out of reach. The old woman lived alone in a cottage on the outskirts of a quiet village where the wind howled like a lonely spectre through the gnarled trees. Her hands were gnarled too, worn from years of weaving and tending to a home that echoed with silence. She had always wanted a child, but time had stolen that dream from her. In the dim glow of her hearth, she sat at her work table, a lump of porcelain clay in her hands, shaping it with careful, loving fingers. She sculpted a tiny girl with delicate limbs and a face smooth as river-polished stone. Her eyes, painted a soft blue, seemed to hold secrets in their glassy depths. The woman stitched a dress of silk for her creation and whispered to it as though it might hear. "If only you were real," she murmured, cradling the tiny doll in her palms. "If only you could be my child." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. The flames in the hearth bent sideways, throwing flickering shadows across the walls. A new presence filled the room, a figure standing just beyond the light. His cloak was the color of midnight, and his fingers, long and spindly, trailed along the furniture as he stepped forward. His face was sharp and pale, his lips curled into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. "A mother's love is a powerful thing," he said in a voice like dry leaves. "And desperation, more powerful still." The woman gasped, pressing the doll to her chest. "Who are you?" The stranger chuckled. "A giver of gifts, and I shall give you yours, for a price." Her breath hitched. "Anything." The man bent low, placing a single finger against the doll's forehead. A whisper of energy rippled through the air, and the porcelain limbs twitched. The tiny hands curled, the painted lips parted, and with a gasp like the first breath of life, the doll opened her eyes. "Her name shall be Thumbelina," the sorcerer murmured. "She will be real, but only so long as she never lingers too long in one place. Misfortune follows her footsteps, and should she be left without a home." He trailed off, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Well, dolls are fragile things, aren't they?" With that, he was gone, leaving behind only the faintest scent of burnt sugar and something older, something wrong. For a time, the old woman was happy. Thumbelina laughed and danced through the house, her tiny feet padding against wooden floors. But the happiness was short-lived. It began with small things: the firewood rotting overnight, the milk turning sour before it could be touched. Then came the dreams, the whispers in the dark corners of the cottage, the feeling of being watched. One night, as the woman slept, a slick, webbed hand reached through the open window and plucked Thumbelina from her bed. When she awoke, she was in the heart of a swamp, the air thick with the scent of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. The toad who had stolen her away loomed over her, his bulging yellow eyes filled with delight. "You'll make a fine bride for my son," he croaked. "A tiny, perfect thing." His son was even worse, a dull-eyed creature who only gurgled in response. The toad's den was nestled between gnarled roots, where the dampness clung to Thumbelina's skin like an unwelcome second layer. She wept, calling for her mother, but there was no one to hear. The fish in the murky water took pity on her, gnawing through the green strands that tethered her to her captor. As she fled, she glanced back, just for a moment. The toads were gone. Not dead, not escaped. Simply vanished. The swamp, once full of buzzing insects and croaking voices, was silent. The water had darkened, receding into the ground like something had siphoned the life from it. The trees stood still as corpses. She looked down at her hands. A thin crack ran along her porcelain wrist. The cold bit at her feet as she wandered lost. Her fragile limbs aching with each step. The landscape stretched before her, an endless sprawl of frost-kissed grass and barren trees, their skeletal limbs reaching skyward like silent mourners. Hunger gnawed at her porcelain frame, though she did not understand why. She was not meant to eat, yet she felt the absence of warmth inside her, an emptiness growing with each passing moment. When she finally collapsed, too weak to go on, she was found by a kindly field mouse who scurried from beneath a tangle of roots. The small creature was wrapped in a tattered shawl, its beady eyes filled with concern as it nudged Thumbelina upright. Poor thing," the mouse cooed, wrapping Thumbelina in a scrap of wool. "You mustn't wander alone. Stay with me. Be safe." The burrow smelled of wheat and earth, the air warm with the promise of comfort. A flickering lantern bathed the rounded walls in a golden glow, and the mouse busied herself preparing a tiny bed of soft moss. Thumbelina, weary beyond measure, curled up without protest, sighing as the warmth of the burrow seeped into her aching bones. But the longer she stayed, the more she noticed changes. The mouse twitched her whiskers more often, as though hearing something Thumbelina could not. Strange shadows shifted at the edges of the burrow, vanishing when she turned to look. The air, once warm and safe, grew thick and heavy, pressing against her like unseen hands. "You should marry the mole," the mouse whispered one evening. "He is rich and will keep you safe." The mole had visited once before, his voice a low murmur from the burrow's entrance, his figure barely visible beyond the lantern's reach. He was blind, but his nose twitched hungrily in the air when he spoke, as if scenting something more than just Thumbelina's presence. Thumbelina recoiled. The mole's tunnels were deep, lined with bones of creatures who had wandered too far beneath the surface. The air within them had smelled of damp stone and something old, something forgotten. She refused the mouse's proposal, shaking her head, the delicate sound of shifting porcelain filling the space between them. That night, as she fled the burrow, she felt the ground quake. The air pulsed with an unseen force, and the lantern's glow flickered violently before snuffing out. She turned back only once. The burrow was gone. No entrance, no sign it had ever existed. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, as though the mouse had never been there at all. Another crack appeared on her hand. The mole's lair was a tomb. The deeper Thumbelina walked, the heavier the air became, thick with decay and the scent of forgotten things. The tunnels stretched endlessly, winding through the earth like the veins of something ancient, pulsing with a silent, unseen life. The walls glistened with dampness, the ground cold and unyielding beneath her porcelain feet. She could hear him before she saw him. A slow, deliberate shuffling, claws scraping against stone. When she turned the corner, there he stood, a hunched, hulking figure. His fur dusted with the remains of his own burrow. His eyes were useless, but he did not need them. He could feel her, sense her in the weight of the darkness that wrapped around them both. "You will stay," he said simply, his voice low and resonant, a sound that came not just from his throat, but from the very walls around them. "You have nowhere else." Thumbelina stepped back, but the air grew thick, pressing against her, holding her in place. She turned her head and saw them, the other dolls, lined up along the tunnel walls. Motionless figures, their porcelain faces cracked and hollow, their eyes empty pits reflecting the dim lantern glow. Brides before her trapped here, forgotten. Her breath hitched. This is where they had all gone. A deep, shuddering crack split across her arm. She had to escape. Now, with a burst of desperate strength, she turned and ran. The tunnels trembled with each frantic step, the walls pulsing as if the earth itself were breathing. The mole's voice echoed behind her, a guttural growl that turned to a roar. And then, silence. She looked back. The tunnel was empty. No mole, no dolls, no lair. Everything had vanished, swallowed by the earth, as if it had never been there at all. Another crack formed along her fragile porcelain wrist, winding up toward her shoulder. Thumbelina had first met the swallow when she lay crumpled in the frozen grass, her body weak and riddled with fractures. The great bird had landed beside her, tilting its sleek head as it studied her with dark, intelligent eyes. "You do not belong here," the swallow had said, its voice soft but certain. "Come with me, little one. I know of a place where you will be safe." Desperate, Thumbelina had reached out, her porcelain fingers trembling. The swallow had scooped her up, tucking her against its warm chest before launching into the sky. Now, as they soared across great distances, its wings slicing through the cool night air, she gazed down at the vast, endless world below. Forests shrouded in mist, rivers winding like silver veins, and distant mountains whose peaks pierced the sky. She clung tightly, her fingers gripping the bird's soft feathers, though she could feel the weakness spreading within her. The cracks had deepened, hairline fractures splitting across her porcelain skin. She dared not look at them. She could only hope the swallow's promised sanctuary would come before it was too late. Finally, they arrived at the fairy kingdom, a place that shimmered like the edge of a dream. Towers of crystal spiraled toward the heavens, their surfaces glowing with an inner light. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers, their petals glistening like dewdrops spun from stardust. Laughter and music floated in the breeze as delicate winged fairies flitted between golden trees, their iridescent forms casting fleeting shadows upon the ground. Thumbelina slid from the swallow's back, her feet touching the soft, luminescent grass. The fairy prince stood before her, his radiant presence both mesmerizing and unsettling. His smile was warm, his eyes filled with something ancient and knowing. He reached for her, his touch feather-light. "You are home now," he whispered. "Forever." A wave of relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. As she turned, she caught sight of her reflection in the golden mirror behind him, and her breath hitched. It was not a girl who stared back. It was a doll. Her porcelain skin was riddled with cracks, her limbs delicate and stiff, her painted eyes wide and hollow. The truth clawed its way into her mind, unraveling everything she had believed. She had never been real. She had never been a child. never been alive. She was a creation, a thing molded by desperate hands and cursed to wander, carrying misfortune wherever she went. The prince's hand brushed her arm, and she felt the final fissure form. A sharp, splintering crack rang through the air. Her body gave way, splintering like fragile glass, shards of porcelain catching the golden light as they scattered into the wind. The world around her blurred, her thoughts dissolving into the void. And then there was nothing, only dust carried away on the breeze. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.